So welcome everyone to this masterclass. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and as part of the NSA NYC, we do a masterclass like this every single month. They're all available for members on our website. And today we are really lucky because we're joined by one of our own, Mike Goldman. What I want to do is just give a little bit of a background of Mike, just sort of read out his bio, give you a few thoughts as to why we selected Mike to be able to share his wisdom and his insights. Of course, we had the wonderful Beth Granger on already this year. But why did we pick Mike? I want to share a little bit about that and then get straight into it. Today, Mike is going to be helping us understand how we can start to move from just doing keynote speeches to also being able to leverage the power of coaching and building a successful coaching business, either on the side or as a primary vehicle for revenue, which also allows it to work hand in hand with our speaking business. So I'm really excited to learn from Mike today. To give you a bit of background, Mike Goldman is a leadership team coach and the best-selling author of 2 books, Breakthrough Leadership Team and Performance Breakthrough. He speaks internationally to groups of business leaders, such as the Young Presidents Organization, the Entrepreneurs Organization, otherwise known as EO. During his 30-plus year coaching consulting career, he's worked with clients including Disney, Verizon, Chanel, and Polo Ralph Lauren. His insights have been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, and Chief Executive Magazine, and he's widely regarded by CEOs as the expert on building great leadership teams. As both a coach and speaker, Mike is on a mission to help CEOs grow their business and have more impact while creating an engaging, fulfilling environment for their team using his breakthrough leadership team approach. I've gotten to know Mike over the last couple of years. We've become great friends. And what I've learned from Mike over the course of the last couple of years in the conversations with him has been a large part of how he sees the work that we can do in terms of business in a deeper way than I think a lot of people approach it from. So I think a lot of times as speakers, we come to the table with great ideas. But what Mike does is his real expertise is in doing group coaching with executive teams. And so he's a lot to share in terms of how this is a really powerful way of being able to generate revenue, but also how to make a real difference to your clients. So I wanted to talk to Mike and learn from him today about how he builds his business. Really, I'm going to go, like I always do, in depth and as specific as possible to try to understand how we can start to leverage coaching, group coaching, whatnot, different coaching business models into our own businesses. So without any further ado, Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
So to start off with, before I get into a little bit about your background, I actually want to start off by talking about what's group coaching. So you talk about you're a performance, or you're a leadership coach, but you don't just do you don't really focus on one-to-one coaching. You do group coaching. Could you explain to us first of all the difference between group coaching from your perspective and individual coaching, and then also, if you would be so kind, the difference between coaching, consulting, and training from your point of view, from your perspective?
I'm actually going to start with your second question, because I think that'll lead into the first one. So I think there is an important difference between coaching, training, consulting, and especially folks, whether they are speakers or entrepreneurs that just sold 2 businesses really successful and say, I want to get into coaching. I think most folks that get into coaching don't really know what coaching is. And they believe coaching is getting in there and showing how smart they are and giving people advice. And that's not really what it is. To me, if I think of training is about pretty simple. You're teaching folks something and they're going to go implement it or not. But training is about teaching folks something. There's crazy value in that, right? Consulting, which I did for about 17 years, consulting is about being smarter than your client. When I was a consultant, I felt like I knew my job was to understand what was going on within an organization and then make a bunch of recommendations on what they could do better. But as a coach, it's not about teaching. It's not about giving advice. As a coach, the job is asking great questions. And it's asking great questions so that the client, whether that's an individual or a group, can come up with the right action for them, which may be different than the right action for you. So I always say, as a consultant, I had to be smart. As a coach, my job is to be dumb and ask a lot of questions. And when it comes to back to Owen, your question about group coaching versus one-on-one, when most people think of a coach, they tend to think of one-on-one coaching, what might be executive coaching or life coaching or whatever your focus is. People think about one-on-one, but for me, because I get more of my energy from a group than I do individually, group coaching is exactly what it sounds. Instead of one-on-one, or in addition to one-on-one, you're working with a group. And in some cases, that group could be a group of folks that all come from different companies or different backgrounds that you're working with together. And some life coaches do that, where they're working with a group of individuals within a certain demographic. But for me, the type of group coaching that I do is working with leadership teams. More often than not, or almost all the time, that's a CEO and their direct reports. I work with them as a group. So I find that not only gives me great energy, but I find that's how I can add the most value. And in addition to the group, I always work with the CEO one-on-one. And I do that for two reasons. One is if the CEO isn't scaling, the company's not going to scale. The leadership team's not going to scale. The other reason I do that is because it helps me to build a great ongoing relationship with the leader of that group, with the leader of that team.
So I've a bunch of questions on that, but before I get to that, could you just give a little bit about how did you fall into this? Like, what was your journey into this briefly? Because I'd like to understand, as in, why you made the decision to go into this in the first place.
Yeah, I'll try and make a long story much shorter, but half of my 35-year career was in management consulting, working for big consulting firms, for Fortune 500 companies. And I decided to leave that and start my first business in 2004, which was a staffing and recruiting firm. That business was a miserable failure for 3 years, whole bunch of money out the window, wrong business for me. But what I started doing, I thought, to build my staffing and recruiting business, is I said, I'm going to be strategic. I've been a consultant half my life. Or at that point, a lot more than half. I'm going to be strategic and start doing workshops for leaders. And that's going to help me build my staffing and recruiting firm. It did absolutely nothing to build my staffing and recruiting firm. But what I realized very quickly is, I was adding a ton of value to those leaders in the room. They were lined up after to come talk to me, but I had no way of helping them because I wasn't a coach or a consultant. I owned a staffing firm. So I was adding a lot of value, and I also realized I absolutely loved doing it. So when I finally made the decision to ditch the staffing and recruiting firm, I said, I'm not sure what I'm going to call myself, but I need to keep doing these workshops because I love it. It's adding value. And that morphed into coaching leadership teams.
And so on that, what would you say are the main benefits? Like, why should a speaker think about adding coaching to their business model?
So, and I'm the opposite of most speakers, the opposite of probably a lot of you, in this session, in that I had built over many years a really healthy, thriving coaching business. And I said, I want to go out and do speaking. I'd always done a little bit as a marketing tool for my coaching, but I said, I want to make it a real revenue stream. And what I found is most of the NSA folks that I talked to were the opposite, where at 70-80+% of their business was speaking. And then COVID hit. And I don't have to tell all of you, for a lot of you, the world shut down, your calendar went from full to empty. And a lot of speakers said, ooh, I need to get out there and figure out how to do this coaching thing. For me, it's been the opposite. And the value of coaching, and if you think about when COVID hit, what happened to a lot of speakers is coaching for me, even while I'm building the speaking part of my business, coaching is a regular, consistent revenue stream. Back in September, I started scheduling all of my clients out for 2023. And in September, I pretty much knew what 2023 was going to look like from a cash flow standpoint. So whereas with speaking, for a lot of us, it feels like a hamster on a treadmill. Had a really good quarter, but his next quarter being good, going to be good. I had a good year, but his next year going to be good. You got to keep getting out there and selling the speaking. Coaching, if you have the right business model, and I'm sure Owen will talk more about some different business models. If you've got the right business model for coaching, it is a regular, ongoing, consistent, predictable, and very lucrative revenue stream. And on top of that, it allows you, sometimes we speak and we hope people are going to take our ideas and go implement them when we leave. Coaching is a way to continue to add value for those folks.
That's great. I mean, I was just thinking as you were saying that, Mike, like for me, I went in and when I moved to the States in 2019, I already had I was mainly a training and speaking business, but because I have so many international clients, I had my year scheduled out. So similar to yourself, maybe by November, December, I had entire following year booked out, ready to go, which was great. It really was so much more relaxing to know that you have that coming up. But as I've moved into the States, especially with more domestic client, more organizations, it's now a few month leadway, as opposed to I have some clients, obviously, some maybe, a dozen or so engagements for 2023, but there's still a lot of room there. And I only find out a few months in advance. So I completely get that. But let's talk about the business models in coaching. What are the various different types of business models that you've come across? And then what one have you chosen and why? And again, we're not talking about the coaching models like, the grow model, or we're talking about the specific business models of how you put this into practice. What are the options or choices that you could look at, and then why did you pick the one that you picked?
So the different business models that I've seen, and I'll go from bad to good, I think in my mind, is number one is an hourly model. I get X dollars per hour. I'm going to work with a client, weekly, this many hours, or I'm going to go in and do a workshop and I'm going to charge them by the hour. I think that's the worst way to do it, because you tend to get looked at as more of a tactical answer when you're charging by the hour. And frankly, if some of you understand as a coach what the potential is, and frankly, if I ever told my clients what I make per hour, they would probably fall off their chair. I don't like to talk about it per hour. So one is hourly, which I think is very tactical. The next one is by project. So when I first started coaching, it was much more about leadership development. And I would do a 3-month leadership development program with a group of folks, or a 6-month leadership development program. That's better than hourly, because you could do things like say, hey, my program is once a week for X number of hours, but I'm available to call me if you need me in between. So you could add value in ways that aren't as easy to calculate the hours. You could also start to look at the value of this 3-month program or the value of the 6-month program and charge a little bit more. What I do, so you got kind of hourly by project. I don't do either of those. I have an annual agreement with my clients, and the annual agreement for my model in particular, I do 2 days a quarter with the leadership team. And that's 2 days in a row. I do these 2-day planning sessions every quarter with the leadership team as a group. I include, as I said earlier, one-on-one coaching with the CEO. I have an open door policy in between meetings. So again, you start adding those things, and I've got a learning portal they have access to. They stop calculating the hours because they're getting so many benefits other than the hours. And what I do that's really important, as opposed to, certainly I know about how many hours I'm spending with a client, but when I focus with my client, we focus on value. So if I'm talking to a CEO who's my initial point of contact, and they're telling me they're a, $10 million business, but they believe if they were doing things right, they could be a $30 million business, and they're at 3% profitability right now, but man, they ought to be able to get to 10 or 15% profitability. You can see very quickly how the millions of dollars of value add up if they're able to get through all the obstacles that are in front of them. So I help them calculate that. I don't calculate it for them. I don't tell them I'm going to double your business. They tell me that they're going to put an extra, $1 million to the bottom line, or $500,000 in cash in their bank account. And then when I tell them what I charge for an annual agreement, which we don't talk dollars on these things, so I won't talk dollars, but it is substantial, where the hourly rate dwarfs what they're spending on their highest paid lawyers. Don't get half the hourly rate you can get in coaching. But when they look at, hey, I've got X million dollars on the table, and then I tell them what I'm going to charge them for a year, the ROI is ridiculous. And all of a sudden, they don't look at my model as being an expensive model anymore. In fact, they don't look at they don't look at it as an expense. They look at it as an investment in making 10x, 20x, 30x what I'm charging them.
So I really want to go in depth on this, Mike, because I think this is very, very helpful, very, very useful to understand exactly how this works. So I'd love to walk through with you from the very beginning to the time that you get a lead, what that looks like. So let's start off with where do you get your leads from? Just at a sort of a level. Normally, where do they come from? And then I'd love you to talk through that, and then also talk through when you first converse with them on the discovery call. What does that look like? What are you doing to be able to win that business? What are you doing to be able to identify exactly how you can help them? What kind of pitching are you engaging in at that moment?
So my leads come from really three major buckets. The first one, and this didn't happen right away, but it happens a lot now. The first one and most important one is client referrals. So you do a great job for a client, they will refer you. Now, I want to be a little bit more specific about that. As great a job as you do, you would think the referrals would just happen. They don't, or at least they don't at the level I'd like them to happen. So when I say referrals from clients, I actually schedule calls with my clients, maybe once a year, very rarely more than that, but I'll schedule a call with my client for the sole purpose of saying, hey, the best way for me, I don't know if you know this, but I've got room for a couple more clients in my practice. The best way for me to grow is referrals from great people like you who know other great people. So are you free Tuesday morning? I'd love to schedule a quick call with you or a cup of coffee with you to run by some people that may benefit from what I do. So being proactive about asking for referrals is number one. And thankfully that's grown as I've grown my business and as I get better at what I do. Number two is from centers of influence. So relationships that I have built over the years with partners in accounting firms, with law partners, with bankers, with other coaches who don't coach in what I do. I don't do sales coaching, but I've got sales coaches that have referred me a bunch of business and I've referred it back to them. So thinking about centers of influence and more specifically, think about whoever your target client is, your client avatar. For me, it happens to be CEOs of mid-market companies that are lifelong learners, really care about their people. I have a very specific bio for my avatar. Who else knows those folks? Who else has a trusting relationship with those folks? And that's where, for me, it's law partners, accounting partners, bankers, other coaches. Depending on where you want to focus, it may be safe. If you want to do life coaching, it's probably not going to be bankers and accounting partners. It may be other folks. So it's referrals from clients, it's centers of influence. And then third is it's speaking. And that's what I'm trying to do more of. But when I'm on stage doing a keynote, or I'm on a smaller stage, maybe doing a workshop for an EO group or a YPO group or a Vistage group, if you're familiar with those CEO organizations, when I'm in front of the room adding value for an hour, 2 hours, or a half day, I just did 2 Vistage groups last year and got 4 clients out of it, which for me is a big deal because in my model, I have, 8 or 9 private clients, and then I have a more of a scalable group thing that I do. 4 clients for me is a big, big deal. So it's referrals, centers of influence, and speaking.
And then on the discovery call, so you have a conversation with them. They've already got you referred to them. They've already seen you in action, maybe from a speaking perspective. When you are talking to them for the first time, what are you doing on that call? What are your main goals? How does that conversation unfold?
What I do is I coach them. I don't sell to them. I don't give them the dog and pony show of here's what I do and I'll send you a proposal. It's not about selling. If Owen, you were a CEO and you were referred to me, very often the first thing I will ask when we get on a call is, hey, Owen, I know you got to be super busy. I looked up your company. I know you're running a company that's got X number of people. You're doing these important things. Why did you feel like it was important to take the time to talk to me today? And from there, they'll tell me what their goal is or what their challenge is, and I'll coach them. The best way for me to understand whether they're the right client for me, the best way for them to understand if I could add value is by me coaching them. So what I'll typically do, if I've got them on the line for 45 minutes, I will coach them for 30 minutes or so. And then looking at the clock, I'll typically stop and just ask them, ask them what value they've gotten. And if they've gotten real value, my question is, hey, are you interested in learning more? Are you open to some more help? Are you interested in learning more about how I can do that? Now, very rarely will someone say no, but they do. Some people say, hey, no, I just was interested in having this call with you, but I think I'm good. And if that's it, that's fine. We'll end the conversation. They hopefully will have gotten some value. Maybe I made a new friend and that's it. But if they're open to learning more, that's when I'll start to dive into, here's how I think I could help. Here's what my model looks like.
And then when you present the model to them, what is the offering? What is the promise or stroke the suggestion of this is why to do this? So when you finally do get to the pitch, you've already demonstrated value, you've demonstrated your expertise, your credibility, you know what you're talking about, you can help. But when you position it that way, obviously you'll talk about the features and you get this, you get this, you get this. But let's talk a little bit about how do you clarify for them? Because when you tell me breakthrough leadership team, I want to know what do you mean by that? I want to know how does that relate to the bottom line and how does that help the leadership team to be able to move it from 10 million a year to 12 million a year or so forth and so on?
It's a great question because what I don't do, if they say, yeah, I'm up for some help, I don't say, okay, well, what that would be is X $1,000 and it would be 2 days a quarter. And that's the tactics. What I do first is I think the answer, Owen, to your question for me. Now, by the way, my answer will probably be very different than every single one of your answers. But I know for me, my coaching practice is about building great leadership teams. I don't talk about, my goal is to help you create a great company. My goal is to help you make more money. My goal is to make you a better leader. Though, of course, I do all those things. But the way I position what I do, which is very different than most coaches, is I help them understand that in order for them to get where they want to go from a $10 million company to a $30 million company, from 2% profitability to 15% profitability, I believe very strongly that what all my clients need to do is they need to build a great leadership team. And that leadership team is going to help them get what they want, help them create a fulfilling environment, help them add real value to society. That's what I do. I know from my 35 years coaching and consulting, I know it's about the leadership team. So what I do is help them understand it's about the leadership team. And I have 6 pillars. And those 6, I could list out the 6 pillars if you want. They're not really important to all of you. I have 6 pillars that I work on, that I know for me and my coaching are going to help them create a great leadership team so they can create a great company. So I'll take them through those pillars, make sure they understand that. And I'll do all of that, help them understand that's how they're going to get what they want before I get into the tactics of here's how long it's going to take, here's how much money it's going to cost, and all that stuff.
So just on that, because obviously you've got your 6 pillars, your framework that works really, really well. There's lots of frameworks out there. If you're doing the 7 habits or if you're doing Lacone's 5 dysfunctions of team, what I'm interested in is when you present it, part of the job on the call, I'm presuming, is for you to explain to them the reason that you're not at 15% or 12% is because your leadership team isn't working as optimally as it could be. So how are you, like, it could be something else. Somebody else comes along, another coach comes along and says, the reason you're not getting there is because of this. And so that leadership team is so important. How do you get them to see how, number one, their leadership team is not performing as optimal as they could, and number two, that's really, really important? How do you get them to see that?
I get them to see that before I even describe what I do. Before I say it's about building a great leadership team, here are the 6 pillars. They already get that. And they get that because of the first, 30, 35 minutes when I'm coaching. I'm asking them what their vision is. I'm asking them what's holding them back from reaching the vision. And normally I get answers like, we have great plans, but we're not holding anybody accountable like we should to get there. We're having problems leveraging the talent we have. We can't find the right talent. Our culture isn't great. I'll get all these answers that for me, and it's the reason why I coach leadership teams, always seem to go back to strengthening the leadership team in order to do that. I will also very purposefully say to the CEO, and it's always the CEO I'm talking to, I will say, tell me about your leadership team. And when they tell me about the leadership team, I will ask them questions on the leadership team. So between asking them what their goals are and what's holding them back, and very often 90% of what they tell me, if not 100%, comes back to obstacles on the leadership team. But then I also, ask them specifically about their leadership team and where their leadership team could improve. I ask them, one of the things I hit them with is, as a CEO, where do you need to get better? And by the way, not only is that important, and the first pillar of creating a great leadership team is self-leadership, so it's very relevant. But I also find out part of what I'm doing is I'm not just trying to sell them on my coaching. They need to sell me, they'd be a good client. Mm-hmm. And part of what makes them a good client is having a very coachable CEO. So if I say to the CEO, where do you need to improve? And all they do is continue to complain about everybody else on their team, and they're not willing to look in the mirror and see where they need to improve, I will help them. I'll coach them along. But if they can't get there, I will normally end that call without trying to sell them anything, because they're not going to be the right client for me if the CEO is not coachable.
This is really, really useful and really helpful, Mike. Let me just, I'm going to go really granular now for a moment, just to move past the discovery call. So they've agreed. What about what's the next step? You send them a contract, they sign the contract. You obviously have a standard contract that you send out for each client. Then what about the logistics in terms of, do you do that yourself? Do you get somebody else to do that in terms of setting up the 4 quarters? What other deliverables besides the online program? Do you check in with them yourself and email them regularly? You just wait for them to come back? What about in between, before the next quarter's meeting? How do you reach out? Would you talk us through some of that details, just so that we can get a really good sense as to the practicalities of it all?
It's way simpler than you think.
Great.
Coaches I know that don't know where to draw the line between coaching and consulting do a whole lot of work preparing for sessions, do a whole lot of work in between sessions, do a lot of work that the client should be doing in between sessions. I remember describing to my kids, my kids are older now, but they were younger and I started coaching. It's real hard to explain to a 12-year-old what coaching is. And I remember saying, I just show up at companies, ask them a bunch of dumb questions that force them to do a whole bunch of work, and then I go home. So there's not a lot. So when it comes to the logistics, Yes, there's an agreement I send out, which is an annual agreement. That's pretty standard. There's nothing complex about that. I just recently in the last 6 months brought on a virtual assistant because I've got so busy that was important. But for the first, 12, 13 years or so, I'm not sure I'm doing my math right, but up until very recently, I didn't even need that. I was for, 8, 9, or 10 clients having to schedule 4 2-day sessions every year. And I schedule it right when they get started or September, October of the year before. So there's not a lot of logistical work to do there. It's all really, really simple. Now I do a little bit of work before each 2-day workshop to create an agenda. And by the way, 80% of the agenda is boilerplate, but there's very little work I would say for a 2-day quarterly workshop, if I do 60 to 90 minutes of work to prepare for that 2-day workshop, that's probably a lot. That's probably more than what I would typically do.
Two quick follow-up questions on that. One is, how do you do payment terms? Like generally speaking, not to get into the figures, but generally speaking, when do they pay and what about expenses, all that sort of stuff?
So I have an annual agreement with a number for the year, and then I invoice them quarterly before the start of the quarter. So they're paying me before I do the work. I never, ever, ever have an issue where I've done work that I haven't been paid for. Because even if they're a little late paying the invoice, they're paying me before the work is done. There are other coaches that like to invoice monthly. Part of the reason I invoice quarterly just makes it easier.
Sure.
For me. I have a bookkeeper that does a lot of the kind of
Sure.
all the detailed, journal entries and stuff, and matching expenses and revenue to the right categories. But when it comes to invoicing, I do that myself. It's super simple.
And you incorporate expenses and stuff, and you identify the timings and the hotels that are near wherever the location
Well,
is.
I have my virtual assistant now does all of the travel arrangements and hotels. They do all that, but it was many, many years. It was 13, 14 years in my coaching business where I was doing all that myself.
And are you doing it on site or are you doing it in hotels or places that they book?
Combination of on site. I have some clients that if we're on site, they do a piss poor job focusing because there's all these knocks on the door. Can I just borrow Joe for a minute? For those, we'll do it off site. Maybe annually, it might be in some beautiful place, but more often than not, it's in a hotel or something with a conference room. And actually still do have a couple of clients during COVID. Obviously, I did all this virtually. And I have a few, 2 clients that still love doing it virtually, and we do it all over Zoom.
So let's talk about the actual day itself of coaching. So you turn up, you show up. Let's talk about the first day of the first quarter that you're working with an organization. Part of that is obviously you're getting straight in. You say you've questions, right? And again, for you to have 2 days, those questions are going to be oriented around what they're ultimately looking to achieve, what's getting in the way, and you're trying to help them to work better. To get going, how do you, from the very beginning when you work with a client, you have to get buy-in, right? So you have to get buy-in with all the stakeholders. Maybe you know the CEO, you've talked to him or her, you've talked to them, and you've had a good conversation with them and they're happy. When you meet the rest of the team, you're trying to get them on site as well. What are some of the things that you do on day one or the first time you meet everyone to bring them on board? I'm not talking just about like an icebreaker. I'm talking, what are the things that you're trying to get into their mind, and how do you do that when you first work as a coach? Because again, you're not coming with like, I'm going to train you and teach you for 2 days so you see how much of an expert I am. And you're not coming in as a consultant going, let me understand your business now, look at this genius advice. So what do you do to cultivate strong positioning on day one?
It starts before day one. So it starts with, obviously the call with the CEO is most important, and my rapport with the CEO. And very often I will have my first one-on-one coaching session with the CEO before we start with the entire leadership team. Because remember, again, my model is I work with the leadership team as a group, but I also work with the CEO monthly one-on-one. So normally, so with the CEO, it's the initial call, coaching call. It's any work I'm doing with the CEO to prepare, but there are typically two different surveys / assessments that I'll do with the team before day one. One is something very particular to my model and a survey I built called the Breakthrough Leadership Team Assessment, which is the team assessing themselves against these 6 pillars that are part of my framework. And number two, there's more of, and that's more of a multiple choice kind of assessment. And then there's a survey, which is more open-ended, which they spend more time on, which gets to the heart of, where they see the major opportunities, what each of them thinks the goal of the organization ought to be, what are the obstacles in their way. I have them do a little SWOT analysis. So they're doing a lot of thinking before we even get together day one. But other than the CEO, I am typically meeting all or most of the leadership team on our initial session as a group, which is a 2-day kickoff session. And in that 2-day kickoff session, I'm starting off with them, and I start every meeting with good news. And good news gets them focused. What is it? Where you get more of what you focus on, right? So I get them focused on good news personally and professionally. So I'm getting to know them personally a little bit. Frankly, they're getting to know each other better just from doing that. But I start them off with good news to get them to get us to break down the brick wall a little bit. And then I go through a very specific set of ground rules to start the meeting, which is, all ground rules around, open, honest communication, how they're going to make decisions together, believing in the positive intent of each other. So I start with good news. I go into ground rules. And then the other thing that's important, and we can dive in, I'll stay kind of 30,000 feet on this, Owen, and we can dive down if you want. It's important to have that framework. Part of the way I build my credibility with the group is I'm not coming in as a big shot saying, I bought and sold 3 businesses, so I'm really smart, and I'm just going to ask you a bunch of questions and give you advice. I have very specific frameworks, tools, techniques that I've built over the year. So it's not just me asking questions and playing smartest guy in the room. There's a very specific framework that we use to help them structure their leadership team, to help them figure out what their priorities ought to be for the year and the quarter, to help them diagnose problems they may have around their culture. For me, the credibility and rapport is built because I'm coming in with a set of tools. So it is, and we'll probably, Owen, get to like, what do you need to support your coaching business? A question around that. But having frameworks versus just going in and saying, I'm really smart, I'm going to wing it. Being smart and winging it doesn't work. Having the frameworks really helps me build that rapport and credibility quickly with the team.
So what do you need to support your business, your coaching business?
Great question. I didn't know you were going to go there.
I just came up with it. I don't know where, but I have this connection to the universal consciousness. So
for me, and to build my speaking business, this is exactly why I'm here working with all of you and joined NSA. Number one, I think this is about the community. And community could be building an informal community of a bunch of other speakers, that are also coaching, but it could also be, there are some great coaching organizations out there. I've been a part of 3 different coaching organizations, which may or may not be the right organizations for you because I do my coaching in a very specific way, but I'm still part of one organization called Metronomics. I was part of an organization called Gazelles for many years and another one before that. Coaching organizations, while I had been consulted for 16 or 17 years in my career, so I certainly had the smarts to go and help companies. I didn't have any IP. I had no real framework to work with small businesses in the way I wanted to, in the strategic way I wanted to. So number one, finding the right coaching organizations help fill in the frameworks and the intellectual property I needed to add incredible value day one with a client. And that was important because as smart as I thought I was, if I had to build a bunch of tools and techniques from scratch to work with my clients, I would have spent 50% of my time building tools. And there's no way I could have paid the mortgage off the other half of the time trying to market coaching and actually coach. So I think one of the most important things you could do is have a community. For me, it was more formal coaching communities. It could be an informal one. Within that, kind of a sub community is I have always had, and I now have this on the speaking side, but I've had it in coaching for 15 years, is a mastermind group of other coaches. In fact, late last week, I had my monthly 2-hour call with my mastermind of me and 3 other coaches. We just get on the line and help each other monthly. So having that mastermind, so having a community, having a mastermind, having a framework, as I said, those are really important from a support standpoint. And then the last one I'd say is you've got to be a continuous learner. Part of the way, my client relationships are typically very long. I have a client I've been working with for 7 years, another one I've been working with for 6 years, one for 5 years. If I am not learning and growing every single day, then all I'd be doing with them is asking the same dumb questions I was asking of them 7 years ago, using the same frameworks I were 7 years ago. And at a certain point, they'd say, Mike, we got it. Thank you so much. We think we could move on and do this without you. But I am reading, a book a week about, on average, actually, some of those are fun books, so it's a little less than that from a business standpoint, but I'm reading a lot, listening to podcasts, going to training, getting new certifications. If I'm not learning and growing, I'm going to have short-term relationships with my clients. And then lastly, and maybe most important, is if you're going to be a coach, hire a damn coach. If you're going to be a coach, eat your own dog food. For me, it's not a coach that does exactly what I do. My coach is all about one-on-one coaching. He's amazing at one-on-one coaching, way better than I could ever be. He could never do what I do working with teams, but he's an amazing one-on-one coach I've been working with for 10 plus years now. If you're going to be a coach, you need to have a coach.
Great. Really good stuff there, Mike. Just a couple more questions and then I want to open it up. We got some great comments. I want to go through all the comments as well. We'll get some questions from everyone else. I'll do a summary and then we'll wrap it up. But one thing that I wanted to check in with you on was, let's say, for example, you do your first 2-day session and you've presented them with a frameworks, they've done some work. How do you know, two parts of this question, how do you know you're doing a good job at the end of the 2 days? And how do you know you're doing a good job when you get to the next time? So like, say, for example, one of the things the leadership team needs to do is be more accountable. When you go in, let's say, for example, you do the second quarter, and let's say you start with your good news. Do you also then reflect back on what do they make promises at the end of the 2 days? If so, do you check in with them on that? Do you make sure everyone has to be accountable for something? Or do you just move on to some other area? And so, yeah, 2 questions. One is, how do you connect the different sessions from an accountability point of view for them? And number 2 is, how do you know when you're doing a good job, or how do you know when it's going according to plan? Because it's, again, being able to judge whether a team is working better. You could listen to the CEO and they could say it, but that's not always enough.
No, and one of the reasons why I don't coach CEOs one-on-one without also coaching the leadership team is I know half of what the CEO tells me is bullshit. Not because they're lying, but because they don't know half of what's going on. So it can't just be, to your point, Owen, it can't just be the CEO saying, we're doing a great job, we're following up on everything you said. So within my coaching model, the answer to your question becomes very easy, because I'm working with the leadership team at the most strategic level. I'm basically the right hand of the CEO. And at the end, these 2-day sessions I have with them is not just me helping them become better leaders. They're doing their quarterly planning and their annual planning as a company in those sessions. So one of the things I tell my clients, I have an agenda going into the 2 days, but I tell them, that I am more than willing 10 minutes into a session, I'm more than willing to throw the agenda away if we determine there's something more important that we talk about, with one exception. Before day 2 is done, we have to have a plan for the next quarter. What targets, financial and otherwise, do they need to hit? What are their priorities over the next 90 days? Who's accountable? And how are we measuring they're going to get it done? The only way I ever look at my coaching session as a failure is if we don't get that part done. And by the way, we always get that part done. Now, assuming I've done that, which is a good assumption, now I'm meeting with them the next quarter. One of the things, you probably already know where I'm going, one of the things I do in that next quarterly session is go back and have them reflect on how did they do with their plan. And each person on the leadership team has a commitment they've made as part of that plan. They go back and they talk about how they've done. Now, if they didn't do well, does that mean coaching isn't going well? Absolutely not. Very often, quarter number 2, quarter number 3, they realized their eyes were a little too big for their stomachs and they committed to do too much. As long as they're learning from that, as long as they're getting better about that, as long as they're having open, honest conversations about it, that's a success. Where it's not a success is if I get back to them, because I also recommend a whole meeting rhythm they should be having without me there in between quarters. On the rare occasion that I get back with that team and it feels like they have not talked about this plan since I talked to them 90 days ago, that's a fail. And that means I've got some work to do because they are not taking my coaching and executing it throughout the quarter.
And how, when you let's say talk to them, let's say John Smith doesn't do very well, doesn't get what he promised to do, and you're as you ask him to be able to feedback how he's getting on, he says that. How do you move away from making it sound like you're blaming and making it like he's the one person, the bad person in class, and make it so that you're empowering the responsibility? Like, how do you tackle that without making it like making an example of someone?
First of all, I mentioned ground rules earlier. The first ground rule is brutal honesty, including me being brutally honest with the group, being honest, especially when it's hard. The second ground rule, and I have 3 ground rules, but the second one is no shame, no blame. So it's when we're being brutally honest, it's not to beat anybody up. It's about getting smarter moving forward. So as long as I'm living those guiding principles, if you just jumped into a meeting midway, sometimes it might look like I'm beating up the team for something they screwed up. And this has taken me some time, but I know there are certain teams or certain situations, certain times I need to be a cheerleader. Hey guys, I know you screwed up, but you've done it before. I know you can do it again. Let's talk about how you get there next time. And sometimes I've got to say, you know what? You guys blew it last quarter. What happened? Help me understand what happened, because I don't get it. There are times I need to whack my clients over the head and be really honest with them, and times I've got to be a cheerleader. And it takes some time to know that, given your style as a coach, but it also takes some time to know the individuals on the team.
So last question for you, and then we'll open it up for everyone else. I want to go through all the comments and also checking to see if anyone who has a question, because I'm sure there's some before we get to the summary and all that. If you were, let's say, Mike, you were speaking, knowing what you know now, you're speaking, you're not doing any coaching, group coaching, and you decide, you know what, I like what I heard from Mike today. I want to start the process. What are the first few steps that you would take if you were a speaker and you want to integrate speaking and coaching, and you want to start in a sense that you haven't done it before? What were the first 2, 3, 4 steps that you would take?
Yeah, I would start with searching out other coaches that have been doing it for a while. They don't have to be speakers. It could be a coach you've been working with. So a lot of us work with coaches, right? So I would search out other coaches from the standpoint of kind of doing 2 things. Number one, starting to build your community of coaches, but more importantly, understand what coaching is. because I think most people that start coaching don't really understand what coaching is or what the right methods of coaching are, how to ask the right questions. There's a great book, by the way, called The Coaching Habit by Michael Bungay Stanier. If you want to be a coach, go buy that book. It's a wonderful book. And I have up on my corkboard the 7 questions that he suggests you ask as a coach, because coaching is about asking questions. I think number 1, build the community. Number 2, at the same time, start learning more about coaching. And number 3, just like as a speaker, early on, your goal is, I just want to get on more stages. Regardless of what I get paid, I want to get on more stages. Do that as a coach. Just get out there. Don't worry about charging, top dollar. Just try and get the repetitions of starting to coach, because when you start coaching, you're probably going to be pretty bad at it.
Brilliant.
And it's going to take a while to get better.
Brilliant. That book, by the way, is The Coaching Habit. It's I also pretty sure I heard Phil Jones recommend that on a podcast once as well. So,
wonderful, wonderful book.
So I've heard a lot of people talk about it. So let's just check in with this is great. This has been wonderful, Mike. Let's do, okay. Hello. Hi, Diane, Ralph, Courtney. Hello. Good to have you on. Beth, hello. Hi, Tara. Okay. Beth loves, as a consultant, you have to be smart. As a coach, you have to be dumb. She loves that. So I agree. Kathy says you identify who you want to do business with, and then you ask for the support of referrals to be able to, so you're clear of the target market. Tara says that's classic Cialdini. I think Tara was talking about, if I'm correct, it's the commitment to consistency, and it's all the reciprocity. So in that coaching conversation that you have at the get-go, at the very beginning, you're both giving them value, giving them great coaching for whatever half an hour, which is the law of reciprocity. But you're also you're asking them the first question, which is, so why is it that you've reached out to me today? So you're making it so that they're now going to be consistent with their prior commitments, and lots of other Cialdini as well at work. Ruth says, love the idea of building the 6-pillar assessment work prior to meeting. Absolutely. Kate says, what's the name of the book? The Coaching Habit. Thanks, Ruth. So who has a question for Mike? And let's see the gallery. If you want to just raise your hand and you can ask, and we'll take a couple of questions. So who wants to go first? Carl.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mike, you had mentioned you had 3 ground rules. I might have missed it, but I thought you mentioned brutal honesty as number 1. Number 2, no shame, no blame. I didn't catch number 3.
Yeah, so there's 3, and I actually had a client just add another that's like an umbrella over all of them. But you're right, Carl, I didn't mention the 3rd. So it's brutal honesty, no shame, no blame. The 3rd is disagree and commit, which, if you don't know what that means, it's basically saying that once everyone is heard, if you are heard, if whoever makes a decision that's not the one you hope they'd make, as a leader, when you leave this room, no one else needs to know that. You need to support that decision as if it was your own. So we're not waiting until consensus. So brutal honesty, no shame, no blame, disagree and commit. And then I talk a lot about believing in the positive intent of others, believing everyone's just trying to do the best they can with the resources they have. So what a client recommended that I started doing is I kind of draw that out, and then I put a circle around all of it. Say all of that should be viewed as believing everyone else around this leadership table. You need to assume that whatever they're saying, whatever they've done, that they're doing it with positive intent. Because if you assume positive intent, you're automatically going to get curious, ask the right questions versus getting angry and lashing out at someone.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Carl. Great question. And Mike, great answer. Who's next? Kathy.
Good afternoon. So, Mike, you talked a lot about, support groups that are a coaching support group. So you talked about megonomics?
Metronomics.
Metronomics. Okay.
Yeah, that's one. And again, that's more if you're focused on business growth, business strategy, and you want to do that as a group, that's a great coaching organization. That's one of, there's so many out there, but that's one I'm involved in.
Okay. And then, so So what's the difference between a group that certifies you versus a group that's like, I guess, when you talk about gazelles and metronomics, like what's the difference between? Did you understand the question?
Yeah, the difference between those two groups, or the difference between types of groups?
Yeah. So for example, like I've been looking into like getting certified as a coach, right? There's specific, groups that certify you, but it sounds to me like, and I've never heard of these groups that you're talking about. Tell me about like, what's the difference between?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So there are some organizations like, the International Coaching Federation is one. Oh God, there's a few others that are slipping my mind, but there's some that really just teach you, and some of them certify you, like there's an ICF certification on just how to be a coach. So it's more of kind of pure how to ask the right questions. They're not giving you any framework for, if you're a business coach, how could you help them assess their talent, or how could you help them, come up with the right, differentiating strategy as a company. It's more pure coaching. So like International Coaching Federation, there are some out there that are pure coaching. And then there are ones that are more specific to the type of coaching you do. So when I mentioned gazelles, there's one called Gravitas Impact I was a part of, Metronomics. Those are all focused on the type of coaching I do, where it's working with leadership teams and helping them grow. Now, I've created my own framework because I've been doing it so long. So frankly, the coaching organizations are less important, but you get those. And by the way, if you're not, let's say you're about health coaching or life coaching. My wife actually just got her coaching certification, and she worked with an organization called Cresser that was more about, I think they call it functional health coaching. So that was not just how to be a coach, but it was real deep dive into nutrition and exercise and all that kind of stuff. Now you get into that world, that's not my world. My world is more the business strategy world, but I think I would separate it between kind of general coaching skills and then more specific intellectual property and frameworks, depending on who you're coaching.
Okay, so for example, for intellectual property and coaching teams more in the business realm as opposed to life coaching, is there a specific organization that you can think of?
Well, the ones I mentioned,
Okay.
Gazelles is one, Gravitas Impact is one, Metronomics is one. There's an organization called EOS, which stands for Entrepreneur Operating System. They're a little bit more of a franchise model versus these other guys certify you, you get access to their content, but it's still totally your business. EOS is a little bit more of a franchise model, but it's very good. And there's a bunch more out there. Action Coaching is another one that's a little bit more. They do some team stuff, but it's a lot of one-on-one coaching for smaller entrepreneurs. But Action Coaching is another. And I can't recommend which is the better one, because it really depends on your model.
Yeah.
It depends. For, you may decide you want to coach one-on-one solo entrepreneurs. Well, then Action Coaching may be way better than Metronomics. So it depends on who's the avatar, who's your target client, and what kind of value do you want to add. That more than anything is going to tell you which coaching organization is right. Okay.
Second question, assessments. So you said you have your own assessment. So you don't use any other assessment tool.
I've used others. I've used DISC. I use it. I used to use it a lot more than I use it now, but I've used DISC. Owen mentioned Patrick Lencioni earlier. There's a great 5 dysfunctions of a team assessment I've used to gauge the level of kind of trust, collaboration, the right focus on a team. So that was a good one. But I haven't used those recently. I'm more using my own. And by the way, the reason why using my own framework is important and my own tools is because of the way I've done it, because I've done it so long using other people's tools. I've kind of morphed and created what's important for me. And then from my own branding standpoint, as I want to get out there and do more speaking, if I get out there and I do a speech on Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, I can add value that way. but I'm only going to make so much money talking about someone else's stuff. If I've got my own model that's about me and my brand, the sky's the limit as to what I can charge for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Kathy, and thanks, Mike, for the answer. Let me get straight into the summary really quickly to bring everything to, I suppose, a close. We started out off, Mike, and Mike was talking, first of all, about the difference between training, coaching, consulting. Training, of course, is educating or teaching people things. Consulting is about being able to understand how their business works and then figure out what advice you can give them, offering them the solutions that they need. In many ways, you're smarter than the client. And then coaching is you ask great questions. Sometimes those great questions are dumb questions, but you have to be prepared to be dumb as a coach. Whereas as a consultant, you're always the smartest person in the room, or at least attempting to be that way. And again, you're trying to get the client in coaching to do the best action for them specifically. Then we talked about exec teams versus one-on-one, and in many ways, when you're working with groups, you're trying to be able to get them all on the same page. As Mike mentioned a little bit later on in the talk, oftentimes when he does work one-to-one with the CEO, if he doesn't work with the exec team as well, then oftentimes half of what the CEO said is not necessarily true. So it's important to, from his perspective, to work with executive teams like that. We briefly talked about how you got into it, Mike, in terms of starting in 2004 with your staff recruiting, found what you really loved, and a few years later decided to pivot into that. Why should we all consider doing it? Well, in many ways, COVID, for example, is an example of when speaking business was hit. Wouldn't it be nice if we had another form of making income? And in many ways, you've got a very good revenue stream, a consistent, predictable revenue stream, so that even by September, you know what your 2023 is looking like. We talked about different business models. You talked about the hourly model, which you did not recommend. The project model, which is pretty much a 3 months or 6 months project, maybe on leadership development or whatnot. But the annual agreement is the one that Mike uses, and he does 2 days a quarter. Also does one-to-one sessions with the CEO, has an open door policy, adds sort of online access to a learning portal as well, and focuses on value. And when you focus on value, you're more likely to make it a lot more lucrative. Where does Mike get his leads? He gets it from 3 main buckets: referrals from clients, but don't just passively expect them to come into your lap. Ask for them, be proactive, and try to make it so that you have a specific meeting. Mike has a meeting every single year with that express purpose of trying to generate more opportunities. Second way of getting leads is the centers of influence. This is connections that Mike has made up in terms of from his networks, other coaches, different partners he's worked with, and then also speaking engagements. So again, from EO and Vistage alone, he's gotten quite a lot of clients recently. Great opportunity to talk to CEOs who can see how much value you can add. In the discovery call, for the first 30 minutes, Mike coaches them, helps them to get results, doesn't sell, starts off with, I know you're really, really busy, so why have you taken this time to talk to me? And then for that 30 minutes in coaching, at the end, he asks, what value have you gotten? Now, as he's doing that coaching, he's also angling some of the questions around the leadership team and around their skills as a leader and how they relate to each other, so that they realize that a big part of the issue is around teams. And then for the other 15 minutes, he'll then talk a little bit more about, what ultimately speaking they're looking for, and offering the value and talking about their vision, and how they're holding themselves back, how their plans are not being accountable to them, they're not leveraging talent enough, the culture is not right, whatever it is, and brings it back to it. Then he'll walk them through the 6 pillars as a sort of a high level, and then the last thing you get will be tactically how it will look, right? What they will need to do in terms of to be able to work with him. And he's also qualifying them, not just them qualifying him. Then there's consulting, the difference with regards to in between the sessions, in between his different coaching sessions, Mike will not do that much work in terms of consulting is like them doing all of this preparatory work and whatever and reviews. In coaching, you just have to turn up a little bit of preparation of knowing what frameworks you're going to use, what questions you're going to ask. He says, I ask dumb questions and I go home. He starts out with an annual agreement. That's very straightforward, says exactly what the dates are. All that sort of stuff is in the agreement. He gets paid quarterly and invoices before the start of the quarter, and it's all smooth. Has a VA that does a lot of that sort of stuff. And in terms of the agenda, he's a basic outline of the agenda over 2 days, using again the frameworks. How does he position himself? Well, he builds rapport with the CEO, obviously, but builds rapport with the rest with a couple of surveys. One is his breakthrough team assessment. It's an MCQ where he goes through how they're doing against the 6 pillars, and also does a survey where he opens up what opportunities that they see for the team, what challenges, what are the goals that they have for the work with them, which starts the process. But then when he actually meets them, starts with good news, where they talk personal and professional good news. And then the ground rule sets up, this is, open conversations, open and honest, how decisions are going to be made. And then he goes into brutal honesty, no shame, no blame, disagree, and commit. And then finally, the positive intention, which is pervasive through all of his work. What resources do you need to be an effective coach? Well, first and foremost, community. He talked about, coaching organizations like Medtronics, like Gazelle. And then, after the great question by Kathy, he talked about Gravitas, Impact, Action Coaches, lots of different organizations you can join. Talks about having a framework IP, which you can partly get from the work with those communities. And mastermind group, which is also great. Framework, as we mentioned, continuous learner, keep learning all the time, develop yourself, and hire a coach so that you're getting coached yourself would also be very advantageous. In terms of how you know when you've done a good job, well, overall, you've got the annual plans, and each time that Mike meets up with them, he does a 90-day planning of the next quarter where everyone says, okay, over the next 90 days, who is going to do what? And one question I've heard Mike say time and time again at our boardroom meetings for the NSA NYC is, he says, who's the one person that's going to be accountable for that? It's not like a bunch of people. It's one person's accountable, which I think is a great question. And then when is it going to get done by? And asking those as well. And then finally, what would you do if you were starting from now? You would search out coaches and try to spend time understanding what coaching is. The book, The Coaching Habit, will help you to do that. Learn more and more about coaching, research it, try to understand how it works and the different models and whatnot, and then throw yourself in there, get experience, practice, do whatever it is that you can do to be able to get as much experience under your belt the same way that we would do it in terms of as speakers as well. I think we also touched on, again, Carl asked to follow up on the other elements after brutal honesty, no shame, no blame, which of course was, as I mentioned, disagree and commit, as well as assume everyone has a positive intent. And then Kathy asked some great questions about the different coaches organizations versus, let's say, an ICF, which qualifies you, and making sure that we're as clear as possible about the different options or possibilities we have about it. I don't know about you, but I learned a massive amount from Mike. So I want to say a big thank you, Mike. It's an honor to be your friend and to listen to you and to learn from you over the course of this hour. Thanks so much, everyone, for taking the time to be here. I really hope that you found it useful, and I hope that you'll join us for the next masterclass, which won't be until January, but we got some cool ones lined up. You'll be able to find out more on the website. But for now, thanks very much, everyone. Be well. Thanks Mike. Really appreciate it, mate.
Have a nice Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you. And thanks to Kate for the infographic. Wonderful, as always.
Great job, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks a million, Ralph. Listen, I have to run, mate. I've got to get into the city for a client session now, but sure, I'll catch up with you during the week, mate, yeah?
Sir.
And happy Thanksgiving if I don't see it.
Good.
Lovely to meet you, Courtney.
Bye, Courtney.
I'll see you tomorrow, Scott.
Bye, Scott.